Chapter 35. If there was ever a time when impatience began to invade Dan's mind, it was that night. He had closed the book, had left it on the coffee table, and had retired with Gustavo to 2 of the upstairs bedrooms. Chippewa had told them that he would be back in the morning with breakfast waiting for them when they got up. Lying on top of the covers, Dan couldn't get to sleep. He was wondering why he couldn't just turn the pages of his book and read the whole thing at once. Of course, there would be many questions to be answered, with each recommendations or tools that he had been given through these paragraphs. But he couldn't wait to reach the end of the chapter. He wanted to get going. He felt sure he could find a way to build a future with what he had learned already. The thought of being sitting in the cockpit of an aircraft was as tempting as ever, yet he knew that if he decided to leave the house before he finished reading the book, he might have to face the worst of problems. Nevertheless, and since he couldn't contain his curiosity, Dan decided to slip down to the living room and see if he could sneak a peek at the next few paragraphs, so that he would have an idea of what the subjects were. He noticed that there was a candle on top of the mantel above the fireplace, and some long matches beside it. He went down the stairs stealthily, not wanting to wake Gustavo, and soon reached the living room. The moonlight streaming through the front windows, as well as the red embers in the hearth, helped him locate the candle and matches. As soon as he had lit the candle, he carried it to the coffee table and placed it beside the book. Sitting on the sofa, he was about to open it when a breath of air extinguished the flame of the candle. Dan swore under his breath and went to relight the candle by the fireplace. As he was about to place the match on the embers, a spray of water put out the fire. He looked around to see who could have thrown a pitcher of water onto the burning embers, but only darkness and silence met his searching eyes and ears. Shrugging, he returned to sit on the sofa, and with the moon rays at his back illuminating the book, Dan opened it and turned to the 6th and 7th page. They were all blank. "I can see that stubbornness, impatience, and succumbing to temptation have not yet abandoned your mind, have they, Dan?" Startled, Dan lifted his gaze only to see the shepherd towering over him across the coffee table. With his arms crossed over his chest, Damien asked, "What have you got to say for yourself?" "I'm not a child anymore, Damien, so please don't treat me like one." Dan was angry. "If you didn't behave like a child, I wouldn't treat you like one." "Okay, but what are you doing here? I thought you were watching over my wife and children, so what do you want with me?" Damien chuckled. "What I want is not important, Dan, but what you want out of life is. If you want to continue being stubborn, impatient, and giving in to any temptation that may present itself in the future, you're nowhere near leaving this house. You're actually regressing. And if you go far enough down that path, you'll find yourself sitting at a desk at Seagate for years to come. Is that what you want?" "Of course I don't want that, but I find it a little tedious to have to read all of this stuff," he pointed to his book. "When I know most of it already, it's like watching a rerun of the same movie." "Okay, I can understand that, yet tedium is not a bad thing when you're trying to build something as complex as a future for yourself and your family. You know, every time someone mentions my family to me, it's like you're punching me back into consciousness. And it feels good, doesn't it?" "Yes, it does," Dan replied, nodding. "Well then, every time you're tempted to do something as idiotic as taking God's time as your own to manage, I suggest you think of your family." Dan looked down to his lap. "Why is it idiotic?" "Chippewa said that I was free with my timing. He said I could read it any time I wanted." "Yes, but that doesn't mean you could just read all you want in his absence." "Then how long will it take for me to finish reading all these paragraphs, do you think?" Damien scuffled to Dan's surprise. The shepherd uncrossed his arms and went to sit beside Dan. "Your son, Daniel, has asked me a similar question some time ago, and do you know what I told him?" Dan shook his head. "I asked him how long is a piece of string." "So you have no answer for me, is that it?" Dan snapped, his anger returning. "No, Dan, I have only one answer for you. Be patient and listen to Chippewa. Remember, he is the only one who will be able to transform your dream into reality. He is the dream maker, Dan. And you should feel privileged to be his pupil for a while." "Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful to have been given another chance, Damien, but can you understand that I want to get to the end of this road sooner than later? The joy is not in reaching your destination, Dan, but in experiencing the journey while you try reaching your goal." "What do you mean by try reaching my goal? Is there any doubt?" "There's always a certain amount of doubt in everything you endeavour to achieve, Dan. If there wasn't, what would be the fun in toward achievement? Doubt or lack of confidence in oneself will lead you into hesitation, but it's in that very thing that you'll exercise your free will." Dan had been listening attentively. "So there's nothing wrong in doubting or hesitating about anything, as long as I make the right choices in the end?" "Yes, Dan. Always think twice before you decide to jump across a ravine. If you know you can cross the distance without falling to your death, then do it. Yet if you hesitate at the last moment, or if you doubt you could leap that far, you will be doomed to fall." "Meaning that once I have considered all aspects of the problem, it's no longer time to doubt or hesitate, right?" "Yes, And now that you've been given another lesson that's not in your book, I think it's time for me to rejoin your family and for you to get some rest." When Dan slipped under the covers later that night, he thought of how Damianos always managed to make sense of everything in life, and he had no problem falling asleep. When Damianos returned to the cruiser, he was surprised to find Stefano sitting at the kitchen table, reading. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked him. "No, couldn't close my eyes. I kept thinking of my dad." Stefano put the book down and lifted his gaze to the old shepherd. "Have you seen him lately?" "Yes, son, I've just returned from the house. Like you, he couldn't sleep." "What was he doing?" "He was trying to jump ahead of the schedule." "What do you mean by that?" Damiano sat down, across from Stefano. "Your dad wants to get on the road of his future and can't contain his impatience. He wants to finish reading his book before he is given all the tools he will need to reach his goal." Stefano grinned. "Yeah, that sounds like Dad all right. He likes things to happen. He is always getting bored when things are running smoothly." "Your dad has an inquisitive mind, Stefano, and when he's attained what he wants in life or reaches a point where he's achieved what he wanted, he needs to get on to something else. However, in this instance, he's like a construction worker who would climb to the top of the ladder without the hammer he needs to fasten the shingles on the roof of his house." "And he's got to get back down to get the hammer to finish the job," Stefano added, nodding. "What did you tell him then?" "I've just given him an opportunity to think about a couple of things." "Such as what?" "Such as thinking about the tools he's carrying before he steps onto the first rung of the ladder." Damiano shook his head and smiled. "But this time he wanted to grab all of the tools in the toolbox without knowing what they were for." Stefano laughed, picturing his dad at the bottom of the ladder and loading his tool belt with everything in sight. "I can see him doing just that. You're right. He likes to be prepared. He always was. He always says." "Yes, and that's fine to a certain extent, son, but you also need to sort out the tools you need and those that you won't need before you climb all the way to the top of that ladder, don't you?" "Yeah, if you don't need a saw or a power drill just to plant some nails in the shingles, why would you take them with you?" "Exactly, and that's what your father was trying to do tonight. He wanted to read every paragraph of his book before he understood what each tool was designed to do." "Everything in God's time, right?" Stefano concluded, returning to the page of the book he was reading. "What are you reading?" Damianos asked, his curiosity piqued. "No Place Like Home," by Mary Higgins Clark. Stefano closed the book and showed the cover to Damianos. "Ah, yes, I thought you might like to read this story," Damianos said. "Did you leave it here for me?" "Not specifically for you, no, Stefano. Yes, it's good that you found it. How do you like it so far?" "It's intriguing, the husband buying the house where his wife grew up and apparently murdered her mother. It's quite something." "How she felt when she entered the house is perhaps what I wanted you or your siblings to understand. Whatever happened in that house came back to the woman's mind as if she was reliving the terrible events that occurred 25 years ago." "And why did you want us to read this?" Stefano inquired. "During the journey ahead you will see, feel, and relive events of your past in the same way as this woman did. She too had the chance to alter her future, and she too reached her goal. However, returning to her house wasn't in her plans." Damianos paused. "You see, you have forgotten about most of the things you have experienced before you left, but as I said before, those important events that have occurred or the teachings that you have acquired along the way are still there, in the recesses of your memory. And once you will be exposed to similar circumstances, those memories will surface and will be as vivid as if they had just happened minutes previously." "So by reading this story you will be more or less expecting the unexpected, right?" "It depends on you opening your mind to the possibilities, Stefano, but most importantly, you'll be prepared and you'll know which tools to grab before climbing the ladder." Stefano chuckled, looking up at Damianos and then returning to his reading. When Gustavo reached the bottom step, he looked into the kitchen. Chippewa was there, busy preparing a feast. "Aha, you're up. Good morning, my friend. Have you slept well?" he asked Gustavo. "Top of the morning to you, Chippewa, and I've slept like a log. It must be the air around this place," Gustavo replied, going to the cupboard above the counter and grabbing a mug out of it. "Where's Dan? Hasn't he shown up yet?" "No, he must be still asleep. He's had a busy night, I think." Chippewa put a couple of pancakes on a plate and poured some more batter into the skillet. Gustavo had stopped pouring himself a cup of coffee and was now staring at the dream maker, coffee pot in hand. "What happened?" "Nothing much, except that Damianos had to intervene before Dan would have found himself kicked out to the pavement." "Why? What did he do?" Gustavo was obviously puzzled. He finished pouring the coffee in his cup and turned toward the kitchen table. Chippewa, meanwhile, continued attending to his cooking. When he was finally satisfied that everything was ready, he brought the pancakes and maple syrup to the table. He sat down. "I think Dan needs to work on his patience. Last night he came down here intending to read the rest of the paragraphs in his book." "Good Lord, why?" Gustavo exclaimed. "Because this little schooling does not seem to progress as fast as he wants." "And did he succeed?" Chippewa shook his head. "No, otherwise you and I wouldn't be here to talk about it. But it was a close call." He paused, pouring some orange juice in Gustavo's glass. "And you said Damianos had to intervene?" "Oh yes. As soon as he learned that Dan was trying to open the book, he prevented him from doing so. But the point is, if Damianos hadn't been vigilant enough, Lucifer would have had his chance to grab Dan and send him back to sit at our desk at the Seagate Company." "And what happens now?" Gustavo asked as he began eating his pancakes. "The plan has not changed, yet I would suggest that we keep an eye on Dan's reactions to what the book is teaching him. He's opened a door last night, which should have remained closed. He's allowed the devil to tease his weaknesses and unfortunately responded to the tease, so we need to watch him closely, Gustavo," Chippewa said, visibly concerned.